Very good morning to everyone.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Good morning, Thakkar sir. How are you, sir?
I'm absolutely all right.
Okay, sir. So, welcome to our third day program, AICT sponsored online 1 week short-term training program on sensitivity towards environmental sustainability in technical education. We have with us Shikha Patidar ma'am also. Welcome, Shikha ma'am. And
Good
today,
morning, everyone.
good morning, ma'am. So today's session we will focus on vernacular construction techniques, which were employed by indigenous peoples and transferred generation to generation. And so within this topic, we will cover the benefits of these construction techniques in sustainability, their cultural values, their aesthetical values, and how the resilience this type of structures can provide against pandemic and natural hazards. So the speakers of today, there are three speakers and three sessions will be there. First speaker is architect Jay Thakkar, then Shikha Patidar ma'am, and third will be architect Tapas Upadhyay. So starting with the first session, I would like to welcome Jai Thakkar sir. Uh, Architect Jai Thakkar is an associate professor and undergraduate program coordinator at Faculty of Design and director at DICRC, SEPT University, Ahmedabad. He has worked on various design and research projects in India, Europe, and Australia. Notable publications co-authored by him are Pratha, Katkhuni Architecture of Himachal Pradesh, uh, and Matra, way of measuring vernacular built forms of Himachal Pradesh. And he has authored Naksh, the art of wood carving of traditional houses of Gujarat, focus on ornamentation. He is also a recipient of Charles Wallace India Trust and Simon Digby Charitable Trust scholarships. So I welcome again Thakkar sir and invite you for expert lecture. Sir, please take charge of the session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. So, thank you, Charumitra, for inviting me over here and the entire team for setting this up. I'm kind of quite grateful. I am quarantined right now, so my voice might be a little low, right? But if you can't basically hear me, just let me know. I'm just gonna. Okay. Can you guys see this?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about largely about one specific architectural practices, right? Which is called Katkhuni Architecture. It's an indigenous construction practice of Himachal Pradesh, and this entire session will look at what are the kind of factors which makes it sustainable, and what are the kind of changes which are happening currently at this point of the time. So just to basically give you a little background about what I've been basically teaching at SEPT University, also heading multiple exhibitions. But we also had set up Design Innovation and Craft Resource Center, where the major idea was to look at building crafts associated to interiors and architectural practices. So we've been running that since past 10 years and working at many levels, from educational program to research, documentation, innovation. We have done a variety of different projects within that. And a couple of them which are kind of interesting are a kind of a parallel project running between SEPT University and NTNU, where studios are running parallel, talking about craft design architecture pedagogy, right? We also looked at vernacular furniture. So this is the first time somebody in India has looked at vernacular furniture in detail. That was looking at Gujarat, Rajasthan, Punjab, Haryana. and we have mapped more than around 10,000 pieces of vernacular furniture across the state, all the 4 states, and all of this is online. That way, we have worked on multiple different projects. These are the 4 publications that Charul Mitra was basically talking about, which we have published. So it started with the idea of wood carving at the first level, then it moved to wooden architecture, and then it moved towards furniture, which is the last one is Sahaj, looking at vernacular furniture. And we have recently published vernacular furniture of Rajasthan also, called Anekya. And hopefully in the next year, we will be coming out with vernacular furniture of Punjab and Haryana. So let us begin with what is the context of Himachal Pradesh, at this point. There's a saying largely in the scriptures that if you have a desire to go towards mountains, then you have a kind of an urge to move towards the higher self. So more higher you go, more deep inside you basically, go within. And it's interesting because my journey in Himachal started in 2005 with the first set of an academic project, and it has been continuing till now. We've gone there multiple times, done multiple research, and interestingly now, some of my students are in Himachal and have set up residency programs and doing the practices that we are doing. So I'm kind of very happy to see this entire circle coming to life. So this is the Satluj Valley. Our major work has been towards the Satluj Valley in Shimla. Now, if you look at the altitude maps, right, the elevation zone of Himachal Pradesh is one of the topmost, compared to the entire, basically, India. And hence, the range basically, interestingly, within the Himachal Pradesh itself, ranges from, let's say, 300 meters to basically 6,000, and that's an interesting variant within a single state itself, at this point. So we were looking at the lower part, what you see as the, Shimla Hills and going towards the Rampur Valley, and towards the Kinnaur. That's the area that we were looking at. Now, interestingly, Himachal is also a seismic zone, and it basically largely comes under the zone 5, and hence it is the most active zone currently within the world at this point. There is, of course, a risk of not only basically the earthquake, but also landslides at multiple levels. And hence the architecture has largely, and even the lifestyle has basically evolved in and around that part. Interestingly, I met a person who was a guru in Baroda, and he had an interesting set of a theory to basically mark this. And he had said that the entire land of India, the way it got attached to the entire plateau, the line is running from Gujarat going towards basically Himachal, and that's the line where the major of the faults that keeps on happening at this point. And he had an interesting theory about it, so possibly someday we may want to indulge in that. Looking at also the forest cover map, Himachal comes under, some of the area comes under basically a moderately dense forest. And one of the largest tree that basically what you find is largely pine and devdar. Uttarakhand is more towards pine. Himachal, as you start going, the devdar becomes a more popular tree at this point. So that's the kind of a forest cover that you basically see, at this point. The central region becomes one of the more denser, but as you go towards Rahul Spiti, it's completely basically barren. So as I said, there's the trees which are largely found are basically Sal, Tuni, Deva, which is the Cedrus deodara, which is called the tree of God at this point, and various smaller other trees which are found. So we started in Himachal, as I said, basically with the field work, So we started with a simple field work of the students in Himachal Pradesh in 2005, where we took them in 2005 and 2006. So we must have taken more than around 60 students in Himachal Pradesh within those 2 years, 3 years, trying to map, trying to measure, draw a variety of different architecture, right from a smaller granary to a larger darbargarh at this point. So a simple set of a measure drawing, and trust me, there are hajar stories which are basically behind this, from the kind of houses that we measured, the kind of basically experiences that we had. In many ways, also, let's say, elating experience, at the same time, kind of how do you say, very sinister kind, very supernatural experiences also that we kind of encountered. But this was our journey in Himachal, which started with the idea of a drawing, and then it started basically moving towards working with local people and trying to see how we can actually take this back. So this is where this whole idea basically came in, that can we basically start working towards it, and hence the research started. So we collaborated also with Australia Indian Institute and University of Melbourne, and did a far more extensive research, along with Krida within the Himachal Pradesh. So Professor Bharat Dave was involved from the University of Melbourne, and myself and Mansi were from the India side, who are doing this research further. So we started with basically, from a first set of measure drawing, we started realizing that measure drawing allows you to go in depth into basically what was there as a building. But we also wanted to go a little more deeper to start understanding what is the culture, what are the facets. So there are two approaches that we took. One was a more ethnographic approach. Second was a more documentative approach. So in the ethnography, we started meeting various people, so from Pujari to basically scholars like B.S. Malhan to O.C. Handa. We met the Rajas, which are there, over there. We met with local authors who started writing books, who had basically books written in Hindi about the cultures, trying to understand what it is. We started looking at the craftspeople. We started looking at farmers. We started looking at people who owned a particular set of lands, drivers, weavers, women. Also, we basically met multiple buas. At some point, trying to understand the Paleolithic set of religious traditions within the Himachal Pradesh. So that was kind of interesting for us, to give a much more larger overview of Himachal. In the technical slide, we started covering basically, doing with the idea of panoramic reconstruction. So we started looking at variety of different set of buildings, and starting getting the idea of panoramic reconstruction is to basically understand the context, and hence not only looking at the building, but looking at a site at a larger level. We started creating an interactive 3D model using image-based reconstruction. So we basically took photograph from all the sites, started recreating that as an image, and created a first set. And this was much more a faster process than going a very in-depth measure drawing, at this point, which allowed us to recreate variety of different architecture or different styles, in a much shorter period of time. So coming to a larger area, basically, and looking at what is Katkhuni architecture. So interestingly, Katkhuni is called Katkhuno also in Gujarati and also in Hindi, which is basically the 90-degree. At this point, there is also a tool called Katkhunu, which is basically there, which a lot of time mysteries use, which is the 90-degree, compass, which they use. Officially, it is known as a cater and cribbage, which is largely the indigenous wood and stone construction technique, at this point. The reason it is very critically important, I looked at basically 90 degrees, because it's a layering of wood and stone, right? Over here, what happens is that the wood essentially act as a tension member, so something which basically allows a flexibility to happen, right? But at the same time, the stone acts as a compression member. So stone takes all the load, and it is without any mortar at this point, not even a lime mortar. It is basically, kind of dressed and put together, and the wood basically takes the tension. So whenever there is a movement, wood allows them, and each wood members are basically kind of dotted with a pin joint, at this point, and that holds the entire frame while the stone takes the load of the building. So that's a kind of an overview on what is Katkhuni, as a construction, and then we start looking at an overall. So from a caterpillar view to a more, let's say, a bird's eye view. So that's a village which is there in Jakhnoti, one of the very interesting village, which has got nearly all the types of, let's say, architecture typology of Katkhuni, within this region. Each village has got a central area where it is basically has a temple in the center, and then it is surrounded by the houses on the side. The same thing which is happening over here is what you see is a tower temple in the center at this point, and you see the houses which are basically surrounding it. Largely, all of them is facing towards the south in order to get the basically south sun over here. Each houses also may have an accompanying granary or a small storage unit, within this. The larger only flat land is around the temple, which you always find, which is used for from a cricket to community gatherings to weddings to every different kind of activities which basically happen within the village. So that's a typical, basically, village. This is a village in Davali. So when we went in 2006, of course, Google basically didn't exist. The maps didn't exist. And then later on, we found on a map, a little image. So what you see, that little red dot, that's the village which you see, where there are houses, community courtyard, temple, and multiple different granaries which are associated to this. Each of the time, the houses are basically staggered in order for the wind, sun, to kind of come in place, so that there's a certain kind of a logic to the entire planning of the village. A typical house is basically largely it's three-layered or three-storied house. Of course, we have seen the houses of the temple which are 8-story at this point. But the standard configuration is 3 layers, where the bottommost layer is a gaushala, for the livestock what they have. The middle is more towards the storage unit, keeping everything intact, and the topmost part is the living unit over here. Interestingly, what you see as an extension, which is a bathroom, which never used to happen earlier, but now they have kind of added to this. And trust me, the view from that is phenomenal, right? Imagine you are basically taking a bath, you open up, and all you can see are the Himalayas, right? The only thing is, when somebody's taking a bath, you make sure that you are not under the bathroom, because there is no plumbing line. The water completely basically flows down, So that's the care that one has to take. The granaries are basically two kinds. One, they're independent, granaries, which are very similar to Katkhuni, or they basically are part of the houses. Granary is an important part as a storage unit for us, like the way bank is important for them. The granary becomes important, because largely for 3 or 4 months, everything gets covered in snow, and food becomes one of the important items, to be stored for those 4 months, 5 months when it is snowing over there for nearly 4 feet, 5 feet. So granary played a very important role in the life of the people of Himachal. These are the tower temples, and this is the temple in Sarahan. Very interestingly, what you see is, when you look at it, you may find it basically 3 or 4 layers, or basically feel it's basically, let's say, 5 stories. But in reality, it is nearly 7 to 8 stories building. And we were lucky enough to basically go inside and have an experience of the entire temple. The long stories regarding, the kind of religious practices, and hopefully, if we get time, we may end up into talking about it. Darbargarh basically are kind of an extension, or let's say epitome of Katkhuni architecture, at this point, because they use the similar methods, of construction, but they're far more complex and also built over a period of time, and hence it is a more organic manner in which basically it grows. Major of the Darbargarh belongs to the so-called Raja. They are still basically kind of respected within this land at this point, though the title has been kind of taken away by government. But interestingly, at this point, major of the Darbargarh also have a temple inside. Hence, the entry to the Darbargarh is restricted, or only till a certain point, and one is not able to go and visit or measure draw them in detail. So, what are the typologies and variants of Katkhuni architecture at this point? Sorry. So, let's look at the typologies, right? As we discussed, there is something called basically house, and this is one of the typology in which basically constitutes the most largest number of Katkhuni architecture, layering of wood and stone architecture, in Himachal Pradesh. If you look at basically a house and look at the typology, they're largely more like a cuboidal construction. So it's like a cube, right, or cuboid, which basically is placed, vertically. So as the house basically grows, it is put basically vertically on the top of each other. It's like a stacking, and in order to grow further, the same stack of 3 module basically gets repeated, or sideways. Now, What is very interesting is that the variation within each of this is not largely brought by the kind of spaces or the volume which is there, but by the associated secondary elements, or spaces like corridors, roof, extended balconies, staircases. That is the one which basically brings a kind of a variance within all of this, depending on the site where it is situated. So if you look at this, the first house, basically what you see, with is in the old Jubal, which is a single unit basically, stacked on each other, and then it becomes much more and complex. And what you see on the right side end corner is the Octa house, which, in our opinion, basically from all the studies, is one of the most refined set of Katkhuni architecture that we have seen, with each stone also dressed to perfection. And interestingly, when we're doing this study of all of this, the first house, basically, which was a Manohar Das Lota's house, was called Bhutia House by the student. And the reason is because it was completely, isolated, not like a haunted, but nobody used to live there, and hence it was that. Versus the Octa house was called the Belgium house because a lot of mirrors which were used in that house were brought from Belgium. So interestingly, students started giving nicknames to all of these houses, which they managed to. A temple typology is far more complex than the houses. Houses has got more a simple way of basically identifying, but the only way to identify largely a temple is by the roof and the roof style. That makes it a little more easier to do that. We did this in our second book, Matra, while working with basically Sky Morrison, and the larger reference has been taken from what O.C. Handa gave us, a kind of a palette on which we have started building up this entire roof typology, which is there. So if you look at this entire typology, over here, you'll see that the most simple set of temple basically employ a gable roof, right? And which is basically like a sloping roof. But in one of the things that you will start noticing is unlike a typical colonial architecture where the roof is very basically flat, a lot of time the roof basically happens to be a curve. So which means that the wooden members are not really used as straight, but rather basically in layers manner in order for the eyes to settle in. And that's how the complex roofing structure has been evolved. That's why it's very important to also understand and study the roof, right? So the first is a gable, second one basically becomes a pent, the third is pent and gable roof, which has a much more larger composition of all the typology of temple. A composite roof tries and basically mixes and merge everything. And the fifth typology basically becomes tower temple, where the temple basically becomes more like a tower, more like a watchtower that used to be there. And the last one is multi-tiered pyramidal roof, right? This is how the temple typology has been identified. So what you see over here is what you see in Vermor is a gable roof. Then in Matwani, you see basically a local, temple, which is the pent and gable, which in the Jubal you can find very similarly pent roof, and further you basically go and find which is a pent roof. So there are complex regions, right? That's a tower temple in Jakhnoti, which is more like a tower temple. And interestingly, what used to happen, the tower temple used to be a watchtower for variety of reason. One larger reason as a protective tower, because there used to be a lot of fights between the clans, and in the watchtower is what they used to keep their food, possibly a lot of treasure at some point. And they used to have a ladder which used to be from the outside, very steep one, which is of course not over here. And during the so-called fight, they would basically throw that ladder down so that nobody could climb up, the tower, and hence the entire population is protected. The multi-tiered roof temple in Parashar Rishi is one of the very unique set of temple, the manner in which it has created the kind of volumes. When we were there, we asked the Pandit, how old is the temple is, and he says, "Saab, 10,000 साल तो होगा ही, उससे पहले भी हो सकता है." And it's interestingly how people basically kind of come up with such numbers at this point. The granary, as I said, has got interesting, let's say, role to play within the lifestyle. So when there are independent granaries or there are cluster of granaries or granaries which are basically within the house. Now, within the independent granaries, they are either basically like a Katkhuni, which is basically stone and wood, or completely out of wood. Same thing happens within the cluster, but within the cluster, what you see is you also find a lot of time a small little temple which is there, which essentially is there to protect the food. You know, the idea of food being one of the very important parameters within their lives. And when the granary is part of the house, either it is like a box within a box, where the things and the food and the treasures is stored, or it is a room itself dedicated and designed to act like a granary. So what you see over here on the chitkul, basically those are the independent granary with the wooden slates on the top. Wooden slates used to be a more popular roofing material. Of course, it has moved to stone and then to metal. We'll also talk about that. And the below are the cluster of granaries, and the right hand side is a single granary, which is there. Right? Now, let's look at the entire set of practice which is there. So we were lucky enough to go to Chitkul, and there was a construction of temple going on, and we could meet the master builders, and try and understand some aspect of principles of construction, some methods, how they do it, what they do. There are various different basically facets which are of course part of this. There are various rituals which are associated when they basically move towards the temple. One of the interesting part of the temple, when somebody basically looks at that, is that every 12 years the temple will have to be renovated, at this point. And every 12 years when it gets renovated, only basically the so-called garbhagruh, or the place of the god, and the doors are not replaced. Rest everything basically gets replaced. So it's very interestingly how you can also identify the timeline of a temple through this kind of elements which are there. So a typical feature of Katkhuni is basically it's more like an infill masonry structure, right? Infill basically wood and stone structure. It's a repetitive system. The bottom part being the most heaviest and more towards the foundation. And as you start going, it becomes lighter and lighter at the top. So a typical Katkhuni building is largely divided into 4 sections, at this point. I just want to basically take a call that because I'm presenting it in the full screen, I'm not able to see. So if somebody's putting in comment or something, I'll not be able to see that. So if somebody has a question, somebody can basically unmute the mic and ask me in between. I'm fine with that. So a typical component of a Katkhuni is basically 4 layers. So one is the foundation, second is the walls, then the upper floor and the balconies, and then the roof, which are there. And in some sense, the very simple method, but the manner in which is basically done, or the way it is kind of put together, has got a certain complexity of course. So if you look at the stone plinth, it's largely filled, so they basically dig up the ground and they'll kind of level the ground. Once they make the trench, up to basically from 2 feet to nearly basically 4 feet is what they fill it up, in order to make that basically land stable. Then they make the basic foundation, which is essentially the entire, let's say till the plinth level, which is made up of the stone. The first point where they basically put the wood, and what you see over here, they always put something which is projecting, and a stone which kind of comes out. That becomes very important part, because this is where the rituals happen, whether it is in temple or within the houses. Another interesting feature that you will also notice would be on the door are the ram horns, which are part of the auspicious process, at this point. So basically, when you look at the, coming from foundation and coming down to basically the wood and stone walls, walls become one of the most important part. It is what kind of constitutes the entire stuff. So over here, as you see very clearly, there is a layering of wood and stone which happens, but the walls are essentially kind of 2 feet thick. So outer layer is constructed, and the inner is basically filled with the rubble at this point. So I'll show you this. So within this image, it becomes very clear how the walls are largely constructed. So essentially, it is the stone, which is the dressed stone, which is there on the outside, and the infill is filled with all the different doubles, which is basically part of it. Now, the interesting part about this is that uh, there's no waste of the material. So whatever is being left over, whether it is basically of the wood or stone, anything is put down as an infill, and it becomes like an insulation material at this point. Each of the wooden beams basically are kind of put together by the dowel, or they're connected by a manvi, which is basically like a butterfly joint which holds them together. And this is how the entire wall kind of is put together. Now, interestingly, when we were there, and one of the building was kind of a little teda, so we asked them, "Ki kya hua? What happened?" He says, "Ki saab, you know, earthquake आया था." अच्छा, oh. So I said, "कि अब क्या होगा?" "कि कोई बात नहीं साहब, धरती वापस हिलेगी, वापस सीधा हो जाएगा." So in that sense, they are kind of quite used to the idea of basically land movements, and earthquake, which has become a common part of their lives. So as we said, that the corner store becomes one of the most important part, at this point, and this is where the first wooden beam is being laid, and it becomes like a projecting stone. And major of the rituals, and in many cases we have heard in the earlier times, there also were many sacrifices, which were basically made as part of the ritual within this. The floor at the basically bottommost layer is basically stone, and in many cases they also put a layer of mud, and which allows basically it to settle in and kind of remove the porosity which is there and any of the insects or anything coming from the floor up. But as you start going up, the floor becomes part of it's wood and wooden planks which become part of it. So what they do is they essentially basically make the entire wall, then they make a kind of a very quick roof, and then they start putting the floors together, because the construction also takes a lot of time, and hence to save from the weather or the rain, they basically make the floor at the last level at this point. But interestingly, you see there are openings within the floor which allows people to go in and out at this point. The projecting wooden balconies are essentially from either one side, or they're like a circumambulatory path, which are happening around. And I feel this is where the life is. Major of our time also in Himachal has been spent sitting on these balconies, talking to people, watching the Himalayas, eating food, enjoying the hospitality of the locals there. And I think one of our best memories are on these balconies, on this, semi-covered spaces, secondary spaces, and this is where life essentially exists. So during the, summer times, a lot of pre-cooking preparation happens, community meetings happens, and this is where people talk to each other across the village. As we said, the roof is far more a complex structure, and this is where the layering of wood and stone essentially happens. The dexterity of roof tells us what is very important, you know. So more the complex set of roof, what you see within this region, more you start understanding that the craftsmanship, all the structural knowledge of people was very important during that part at this level. So as we said, basically there are different types of roof which are there uh, within the Satluj region. Uh, this is a kind of a basically roof for the houses and roof for the temple. So imagine at this point that to basically make a roof, which is a very complex set of roof, you will, or at least the person who's master builder would need not only the knowledge of material, but also the structural understanding of the place. So if you look at the roof construction, as I said earlier, that they are not something which is basically, let's say, wooden beams at an inclined level, but they are layerings of beams. So they are basically all horizontal beams put together, right, in order to make a curve. Now, the reason at some point to also do it is so that which should allow the ice to sit on it, right, and the basically snow to sit on it, not really ice, snow to sit on it, and that is what will form an insulation layer, at this point at the top. They also have provided smaller vents at this point, which will allow the smoke and everything to kind of go out, which happens within the house. Each of this basically slate tiles which are there they're put on the roof, and because we were part of the team, and we also saw the entire construction process. We actually lifted that up, and each of this would be at least around between 20 to 27 kgs, and in the houses that we basically put together, there were more than around 800 pieces which were used. So you can imagine the kind of weight the entire house is taking, only due to the shingles at this point. Now, very interestingly, basically for the temple, the last bim or the ridge bin, right, or the ridge pole called Kurud becomes the most important, because that beam comes from the let's say the forest of gods. Now there's a whole, let's say, ritual process associated to that when people go there, and how they cut the tree, how they bring the tree. So there's an extensive puja which happens before they kind of cut the tree over there. And in this puja, nobody is allowed except few of the people, and hence we are not able to really know and understand what happens. But one of the things that we came to know during this entire process was that whenever they cut the tree and when they bring it back to the village, the whole idea is that the tree should not, or the trunk of the tree should not touch the ground, and that is how they basically make sure, that it has been brought back. And one of the reasons is some point so that it does not basically take the insects or anything which basically, or termites which kind of climb up on that. Now, when they bring the Kurat back over here and when they install it, it is at that point the completion of the temple happens. But the one of the rituals that follow post that is a sacrifice, of basically one of the animals, and the blood has to basically drip down to the Garbhagriha, and that is when the completion of the entire temple happens. Now, if you look at basically the house, this is what you see on the left hand side in the color are basically the drawings that we have made, which looks at the entire wood which is being used, and the black one is the stone. And what we did is, when they are building the temple or the house, they bring all the components and assemble it. We kind of did a deconstruction of that in order to understand how many components and what all has gone into making of it. So these are all the different components basically which are being used, in order to make one single house. Now, interestingly, Lorenzo did research and study, using the set of drawings that we had basically made. He's based in Delft, and he said that nearly around 1800 to 1900 pieces, and looking at 79,000 kg, of wood which is being used, and the same calculation he made for the stone. We still don't know whether this is completely correct, but it's an interesting set of calculation that somebody is able to derive post building of it. And this is where also the kind of question kind of comes in, that how much would your building weigh? So this is the construction sequence, what you basically see, over here. So as you see over here, it is all layered construction. So it's a layering what happens. It's more like a lasagna, at this point, where layering of basically wood, or layering of wood and stone happens, and then basically finally the roof comes on the top. So who are the people who do this, right? These are the people, So we met multiple craftspeople, artisans, builders, masons, people in the mines, people who basically cut the stone, in order to understand the entire set of the process. One of the most important part is that who will build the temple, right? And it is essentially the god who decides. So the guru, or basically the pandit, Mali, he becomes a medium who comes in the trance, and then basically, says a name. So that person is called in the front of the committee and says that he or she would want to make the building or build the temple. Now, temple is like a very important project, and it is also associated to idea of, in some sense, supernatural powers and beliefs and systems which are very ingrained in that society. So the fact is, who at that point would really, say no? it is essentially like saying somebody comes to you and says, okay, would you like to do a central vista? And would you say no? Right? It's like that. So would you like to build a temple? And everybody accepts that. Now there are perks to this, and there are disadvantages. The temple takes around basically from 5 years to 15 years within this. We met the people, we met the master builders who basically build the temple, and there are a variety of rituals and processes which are associated and around that. So one of them is that the master builder has to stay at the site of the temple. He cannot go back to visit his family. He cannot copulate. He cannot have children. He cannot wear shoes. He cannot shave. He has to eat there and then, within the temple, and he has to eat only once. And plus, he has to perform various pujas, in order for building the temple. And interestingly, the guy whom we met, basically, Sharmaji, he actually follows nearly all of them, in many ways. Of course, some of these rules are bent over a period of time, but I'm just amazed by the way people really stick to the idea where the culture and the building practices both are so interlinked and ingrained with each other. So, as we said, the wood is brought from the forest. This is a place called Gawas, and it's it's phenomenal. It was a chance discovery in 2013 when we were there. uh, and they were building one of the temples, and you look at the kind of complexity of the architecture and the style, which is there. uh, and it's just mind blowing. So as we said, that the wood basically comes for the temple from the forest, but one of the interesting part that they used to do was, okay, earlier there used to be a tradition that when a child is born in the house, they would actually go and plant the trees, around. So that was like an investment back into the nature. So when the child grows up, you know he or she has the possibility of actually using those set of resources, and that's a kind of ritual that they keep on performing over a period of years and years, you know in order, in some sense, also having the process of reforestation at this point. uh, just a minute, I'll just be back. Sorry, my apologies. I'm back. So as I said, the investment essentially happens back in the nature, and I think that's a beauty of what is there. The entire cycle, in some sense, hence it has become sustainable, at this point. So what are the different building crafts which are used, right? So within this, there are wood carving, turning, carpentry, metal craft, stone carving, and finishing and painting. One of the most exquisite, uh, let's say, carpentry work is what you see at a building level. Of course, we have seen things at the furniture level, but at a building level, and the ability to put such a building together is like a magnificent. So look at the kind of joinery systems that they've essentially worked out. Uh, that's a roof of the Theok Palace, which is there, and entirely made out of basically wood, and on the top is the slate construction. So, uh, in order to have such a large, big span, of roof, it requires a tremendous amount of uh, how do you say engineering knowledge, which is largely passed on from generation to generation at this point, from fathers and forefathers through the empirical method over here. Wood carving is an interesting part. So you find that basically throughout the Himachal. Of course, when you go to Uttarakhand, it is much lesser. But Himachal has got a lot of wood carving, and it has more towards a folk style than towards a more traditional classical style of carving. It also talks about variety of different stories, which are basically there from Mahabharata, Ramayana, Krishna, epic, uh, and multiple different local stories embedded, within the buildings. Wood turning is also an interesting. So what you see over here are called jhalars and like a hanging pendant. And when the wind basically moves, they kind of make an interesting sound. So it's a kind of a reminiscence of things which are already there. Of basically nature, which is translated to the building. And what you see on the top is cone and flower motif, which has been seen very popularly from Himachal, coming down to Kashmir, Nepal, coming down towards Gujarat, going towards Assyria, Egypt, Italy. You find this cone and flower motif as one of the very common emblem, of expression across the terrain. Uh, those There is not a detailed set of study which is done on that, but I think it might be interesting to know how it has traveled across the region. The painting and the finishing basically happens at multiple levels. So a lot of times wood is painted in order to protect it, but even the expression are phenomenal in the way and manner in which basically it is done. Stone carving has not really evolved so much. It is more towards the stone dressing, which became popular, but not really stone carving because it's very difficult to carve and it also is highly time consuming at this point. Metal crafts has emerged as a spurs, where it is largely used as an embossed plate or used for the hardware or bells or the mask, at this point. So now let's look at basically a kind of facets within which why it makes it sustainable over here. So as we said, it uses the local material, which is obtained from largely the surrounding. So the stone which is obtained from surrounding and the wood which is devdar, which is from there. And hence the weathering effect is much lesser on this material because it belongs to that region at this point. It responds to the climate. So when you look at basically all of this, during the summers, the outside basically places become very important, So the curvilinear basically roof, in some sense help the shading area at this point. It allows spaces to become usable. But when you go towards, let's say, the winter, becomes inside, it becomes like a box. People can travel in and out basically from top to bottom without really basically going outside because there are internal doors, smaller ladders which are there. Gaushala becomes an interesting part where, because they are kept at the bottom, the kind of heat that it basically comes out of it slowly rises up and keeps the upper area also warm. Now, one of the very interesting thing that you basically see over here within the Gaushala also is they also put basically let's say little hardware which is basically there at the from the top, which allows the door to be open and close without really getting out of the house, which would allow the livestock to possibly move out a little bit and then come back on its own. So this is how essentially the shell and the core which happens during the winter. As I said, the ice basically stays on the top, making it like an ice bank or ice ridge, giving it insulation, at the top. Completely low maintenance, right? So they use the stone, they use the local carpenters, local builders. Everything is from the region. It's easier to repair and maintain. So a lot of time during the earthquake, when it moves or shakes, basically, or during the any of the energy, some of the stone pieces falls down, and it basically they put it back, by themselves. So they do not need any high end, uh, let's say, skills in order to basically repair or maintain these buildings. Also, it is highly energy efficient because it's a cuboid essentially, which is stacked. The lot of time the doors and the windows are not basically consecutively on the top of each other; they are kind of staggered in order for the energy to dissipate and not really basically open up the building. Uh, the material do not deteriorate over a long time. They also can be used and reused. So when they basically put the let's say remove one of the buildings or one of the building basically goes down or tears it down, all the material can be reused. A lot of times wood also can be reused, and hardly there is any wastage. One is while making the building. Second, even basically in terms of the life cycle, because all of this material can be used. So the wood which is not which cannot be used is also used as a firewood, in the later part. As we talked about the structural resilience, because it's a non-rigid construction, it allows it to kind of move during the seismic forces, or during those movements. So, in some sense, also the slates at the top, because they are also pinned only with a single nail. So when the building moves, possibly few of the slates basically may fall down, but otherwise the entire building more or less remains intact. The base basically acts as a foundation, at this point, which is like in some sense, like our body, which is like a thigh, which takes a major load. And as we start going up, balconies are basically giving it the center of gravity, which is what controls the center of gravity, and the roof holds the entire building together. So, as you basically seen that the building, when the building starts getting constructed, the slate on the top, gives it a weight, gives the entire body basically, and maintains the center of gravity. Community becomes one of the very interesting part where everybody gets involved into making of a building, whether it's a temple, whether it's a houses. Now, the when we visited basically one of the temple, you know, everybody has got different roles to play, and everybody gets involved. So a lot of time, even the house owner gets involved into making of the building, and the neighbors also help. In the earlier time, it was more like a barter system that you help me, I help you, and then that's how we basically build the entire community. Um, Major of the material that they use are biodegradable from not only the building construction, what they do, but also from the interior element, from the furniture, from the chulas that they make, which are made by the women themselves, by the way they use the finishing. So all of this material which has come from the earth will go back to the earth without really damaging the system. Now, as we talked about basically the efficiency within this, that below is Gaushala, mid layer is largely the storage unit, and top is the living unit. Uh, Interestingly, what happens is that there are, what you see over here, there are staircases which basically go up and down internally. So when the entire house is locked, they can still travel to the bottommost Gaushala, and come to the top, without really going out of the building. As I also said that within the Gaushala, because it's a warmer place, they also make a little hole and provision for bees to come and make beehives. So they make boxes within which they make the beehives. It's like a symbiotic relationships, where they basically give them a space, and in return, bees give them the honey, right? Uh, all different chulas, right, which are basically you see across all the different houses, are made by the women, depending on the size of the vessels which are available, as well as the number of people within the family, and hence they are all customized to the needs. Uh, Hence, if you really look at basically Katkhuni practice, it is one of the key construction practice. So when one looks at basically a larger picture, looks at community practices, resources, innovations, environmental partnering, seismic resilience. There's a lot more to learn from this at this point, and there are many ways one can learn from these practices. Of course, currently there are different challenges which are happening. So if you really look at basically the traditional Katkhuni houses, now slowly there is a insertion of basically brick and concrete which has started coming in. So slowly the movement basically started happening where the traditional Katkhuni houses started having open balconies which became covered. Then it started basically getting entire glazed at this point, which then moved towards basically metal roofing systems, and then it has moved largely towards the concrete roof and the bricks. Uh, and in some sense, that is changing the entire facade or entire, let's say, ecology of the system. One is not saying that do not adapt to the new technology, but one can integrate the traditional and the contemporary technology which are there together. We can use the artisans' traditional knowledge, building knowledge which are already there, rather than building concrete structures, which are over there, which are not also basically earthquake resistant. You know. So this is what is happened. So when you look at basically, let's say Himachal, uh, it is now becoming conglomeration of, uh, let's say, hazardous buildings all coming together. Recently, there was a water shortage in Dehradun, at this point. And looking at if this is how the development goes on a rampant mode, it is going to basically be, uh, let's say, disastrous over a period of time. Uh, so, when you start looking at basically new material, uh, one can start looking at how the new materials which are basically coming up can be integrated with the traditional ones, at this point. So if you really look at basically the Katkhuni system, right, there are currently issues which are there, right? One is the availability of wood, which is happening, availability of stone mining issues. There are no regulatory bodies. Government has now put basically ban on the wood because there was a lot of illegal sourcing of the wood, which used to happen. Uh, but there needs to be some kind of a systems and policies in place which can basically put all of this together at this point. So just give me a minute. Okay, my apologies. So we need to find basically materials which will help in. So over here, what they started using is the concrete blocks along with the wood, and I thought that was a kind of an interesting way to go about it. So one will have to find ways and means of amalgamating the traditional material methods, with the emerging technology and the currently available materials at this point. So, in terms of the way basically the lifestyle impacts and changes which are also happening, the aspirations which are also happening, there needs to be a more stringent methods and policies to look at what can be inserted also at both at a more larger basically urban level, what has to happen, and at the same time coming down to smaller details in terms of material, in terms of joinery construction, uh, the usage of it, the idea of even at some point to also start training the local builders, carpenters, in order to amalgamate both of this together. There are also emergence of new amenities which are basically there, at this point. and one needs to understand that how does one integrate it with the traditional practices which are already existing. Some of the issues which are also happening is that people do not want to learn from the traditional people and the knowledge which is there, and hence the indigenous knowledge and its lack of transfer, is causing it to basically vanish. So one needs to basically also put in systems where one learns from the locals, from the people, from the carpenters, artisans, builders, on how to take this further. One of the ways to basically bring the building crafts, indigenous construction practices, and design education together. Currently, none of the subjects across basically India and in many places, they really do not talk about the vernacular architecture. They do not talk about indigenous practices. At engineering level, at architecture level, at design level. So one needs to bring that within the formal education system, or at least have some kind of a method where such kind of knowledge is transferred through local practices on the field, to begin with, and then that can be taken forward or can be reinterpreted and contemporized. So, as we say, there are adaptations and changes happening, and hence our role becomes extremely important. So, transformation is an inevitable consequence of the societal change. But we also need to look at the economical aspect, ecological aspect in the longer run. Katkhuni basically is, let's say, kind of empirical methods which has been running over a period of years or basically of generations, and one needs to learn from it and look at it how its resilience and principles can also be applied or hybridized or modified in today's context within the modern living and within the material limitations that we have. So these are the new composite materials which are basically happening, which are there. So concrete blocks, bricks, metal roofs. Part of the thing is concrete. So when we were there, a lot of the temples, they were getting renovated or repaired and maintained, and they used essentially concrete at many levels to basically stabilize it. So one can work with the unison with the traditional and the modern set of technologies together. Right? This is basically recent images from the Nagar, where one of my students, Rahul, basically, worked in order to not only restore the house but also added new set of features, and elements to the existing house, using the bhatti construction methods, or the local construction methods which are available. So one has to find solutions and a kind of a balance and equilibrium between the both. These are some of the contemporary examples. This is by Lorenzo, who had basically used the idea of brick and stone, and developed a more contemporary aspect of how it can be used. This is the cabin by Rahul Bhushan, and I recently saw a very beautiful photograph of actually the snow on the top, and this was just a day back, and we thought which was very beautiful, So looking at contemporary forms, but yet using the traditional construction methods and principles, and taking this further. This are the example by Leti 360 Studios, using both wood and stone in a different manner, as well as basically the Lotus School by Arub Associates. So all we are saying is that there are many ways in which the blend of the modern and the traditional can happen, vernacular can happen, largely by the adaptation. So I'm just going to quote this. So through adaptation and by embracing new representation that appeal to a younger generation, that is through change, the connection to vernacular traditions will be maintained by the people who value them. The spirit of the collective adaptation adds to the permanence. We hope sharing this work can promote scientific and meaningful combination that can carry forward the spirit and values of Katkhuni while blending old and new in the fascinating ways. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. Now the session is open for question answer. If you have any queries or you want to ask some question or discuss something, please be open.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sir, I am Pratik Aherwar. I am pursuing my
Yes,
master
Pradeep.
degree from IPS Academy Indore, and also, sir, I am writing a research paper on Katkhuni construction technique and seismic performance. So, sir, my question is it possible to make such a real model of Katkhuni building from which we can test its seismic performance by using homemade seismograph? Sir, is it possible? And if yes, then how, sir?
Um, See, there are ways in which one can basically try and test, right? What you saw, major of the houses are time tested over a period of basically 40 years, 70 years, and has been going on through generations. Now, anything that we basically want to do new at this point, one will possibly have to start using the modern tools and methods, which are largely used in the labs, at this point, and to try and test. One is to look at the traditional methods and how efficient they are, right, within the system, vis-a-vis the new materials and the methods that we basically want to incorporate at this point, right? Now, if we start looking at this set of scenario, uh, when we basically were doing the project, we actually had applied for the grant from the AII, that's Australian Institute, where one part of the project was to actually build a real life mock-up, in Himachal Pradesh, and then to basically look at not only whether it is working or not in terms of trial and testing, but also to look at its acceptance within the local community and the people over there. So as I said, my one of my student Rahul Bhushan, who's currently working there, he is using these traditional methods at some point, and also trying to incorporate the new set of materials. Now, all of this is a very longer period of time, but if we can take this into where we basically do the lab testing, for any of the earthquake basically prone material, right? If we can kind of take this towards a lab, which is there, and try and test it, I think so. There are new sets of results which can emerge. We currently have not been able to do any of those things because our first set of focus was to even understand, because there was hardly any data when we went in 2005, about the vernacular architecture or Katkhuni construction. So for us, the first part was to actually identify and understand what it is. So we'll be more than happy, Pratik, if we can help you in giving you any information that you need from our side, and if you're going to take this research further, more towards the idea of understanding the sustenance or, its resilience towards earthquake or seismic forces, we'll be more than happy to help you with this.
Thank you, sir. Sir, my second question is, sir, I went to Chitkul in 2016, and what I saw there
Yeah.
that people are shifting from old houses to new houses, which are made up of new construction material like concrete, RCC, etc. Sir, so my question is,
Yeah.
why did people abandon their traditional building technique and prefer to build poorly designed concrete houses, which I think are not suitable for that kind of terrain?
Yeah, aspirations here, to be honest. Why are we moving from basically Bajrika Rotla to McDonald's burgers at some point, right? These are the change which are inevitable change, right? So when we were working there, it's a similar set of questions that we also used to have. Okay, they have such a brilliant, basically, vernacular architecture which is already there. And why do people want to shift to the houses which are basically not even climatically sustainable, not environmental sustainable? Why they want to, even basically aesthetically, they're kind of unpleasing in many ways. And while sitting over there, once I realized that the one is to question them, right? And second is if you really want them to basically be part of this, right? One will have to basically show it to them and prove it to them that the vernacular architecture is still valid and still sustainable at this point. Now, at that point, I realized that it is not possible for me to basically work in Himachal for basically long, because we belong to Gujarat, and one can basically do back and forth, but one cannot stay in Himachal. And hence, I realized that possibly education is one of the ways and means in which we can translate this knowledge to a younger generation who can then carry it forward. And I'm very happy that some of my students are basically now based in Leh, Ladakh, Himachal, Kashmir, and trying to revive these traditional methods and systems. It's a slow process, it's a long process, but it's about aspirations, and we cannot do anything when it comes to aspirations at many levels. Also, some of these houses do not incorporate variety of new amenities or modern amenities at this point. They were not built with basically plumbing systems. They were not built with electric systems, or any of the new heating systems which are there, right? HVAC. So anything that one needs to do new, one may want to incorporate possibly passive systems, at some point. But at least only if we basically incorporate them within the traditional systems or amalgamate them, people would want to hold on to it. Otherwise, they are soon going to vanish.
Thank you, sir. Sir, my last question is, sir. Well, sir, you have already told about this earlier, but I want to know this again from you in little detail. Is that we know that most of the modern houses had collapsed in earthquake, which came in 1991. But these houses, which were made of old technique like Katkhuni, were kept standing. So my question is, what was that feature in this building which make it seismic resilient?
So one of the biggest reason is the basically flexibility, right? Unlike, let's say, with the concrete, concrete is basically too rigid, right? And hence, when the earthquake or the movement happens, essentially, the crack would basically transfer up from the bottom up, from the ground basically, and it will go till the top. Now, what happens within the Katkhuni, because it is layers of wood and stone, which happens over here, that's one of the reasons why you also look at the new earthquake building systems. They have got intermediary, basically, beams which they put in between so that the cracks would not go. So in this case also, when the building moves, essentially, it is the wooden frame which holds the building together, which allows this level of flexibility, right, which is there. So the cube or cuboid essentially moves towards little trapezoid. It becomes a little trapezoid during that movement, and the cracks would not basically travel up because this is the stone which is kept is also not with a cement mortar or a lime mortar, right? And hence it does not allow. It will basically fall apart. So a lot of houses that we have actually noticed have got basically where the wooden frame is intact, but a lot of time the stones have fallen apart, and people basically put it back. So it allows the energy has to dissipate, right? So imagine it's like a bottle which is standing. You basically push the bottle will fall down because it's one single rigid structure at this point. But if you are standing and somebody will push you, you will move, right? Because you have an ability, because your entire body is flexible, right? So the basic primary reason is for the energy to dissipate. It needs to be flexible enough, right? That's a simple law, and they've been able to do that within this building. Does that help you, Pratik?
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. I got it. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Shikha has raised a hand.
Yeah. Sir, inspiring. Your lecture is quite inspiring. And you have given all the aspects of the vernacular architecture.
Thank you, Shikha.
And our construction.
Ma'am, your voice is not coming clearly. There is some interruption between.
Now you can hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So your whole lecture is quite eye-opening for us, and it gives a vision to see the vernacular architecture in a different way and learn from it and apply in our knowledge system. In the traditional knowledge is so valuable that we have lost that knowledge in our current education.
It is. I do agree that we have kind of lost it at some point, but I think so. It is. It's if you're able to take it further, because see, I at some point when you're working also with the vernacular architecture, when you work with craftspeople, variety of different things, we have realized that at some point we might also have a certain romanticism and nostalgia towards what is tradition, and what it basically means to us. And it took us also quite a while to basically detach ourselves and look at it objectively. And we realized that not everything basically is valid within the current context, right? So if one has to continue, one will have to evolve, change, and modify vis-a-vis the current context, still keeping the essence of traditions, vernacular principles, everything in place. And it's an ongoing process, at some point. And possibly this is the reason why all of you are here, and some of you will be able to take this further, you know and hoping that at least some seed of thought has gone into your life, and which will basically take it a form which will help all of this furniture or architecture, and the traditions to continue.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
uh, we have one more person, Brish.
Hi, sir.
Sorry, I'm only able to see part name, so I'm
Yes,
not
sir.
able to see the full name.
Yes, sir. So your lecture was wonderful. Sir, my question is, as you said that we should integrate it into the education system and all that. But how to make people really sensitive? Even if we still are belonging to the villages, we come from those roots, so we are able to understand it. But when it comes to integrating or to the education, why do we take a back step?
Ah, yeah, because at the end of the day, we are still a human race, right? We are still part of a larger community, larger society. We get influenced by media, now by social media at this point, by the society and what it basically means. So currently, this whole fad of basically organic food has been very popular nowadays, you know, and that is becoming like a little craze at some point. It has got its merit, it has got its basically the downside also. But in many ways, we are controlled at a conscious and subconscious level by the society, also by the policies, by the government, which basically kind of makes them, or people who sit in those cabins and are pretty clueless about what they are kind of formulating, at both levels, at education level and at a larger level. Uh, so the way I see forward when we were basically working with this, because when we started our Design Innovation and Craft Resource Center, right? We wanted to work with artisans, and we realized that there's no information, right? So this is I'm talking about essentially 12 years back. There was no information on the artisans, on where they are. But if you really look at architects, designers, we have got basically LinkedIn, Corefloat, variety of ways in which you can actually identify them. So we went to the government and basically asked them, okay, do you have a data on all the basically artisans, who have got such traditional knowledge? And they say, yes, we have got it. And we says, okay, why don't you share it with us? And they said, file an RTI, you know, and that's the kind of an attitude that people basically have currently. So one of the reason basically I've realized that all of this is not happening is because people refuse to share, right? Before us also there are n number of people who have done possibly study on traditional architecture, vernacular architecture, and variety of things, but you hardly find those resources because a lot of time people are not ready to share. And that's one of the reasons that we decided in essentially 2012-13 that whatever we will do, we'll put up everything up online. So the 12 years of research, whatever we have done till now, all our drawings, all our reports, all our methods, pedagogies, exhibitions, panels, toolkits, everything is what we have put online for people to basically kind of, have and share. I think that's the only way to go forward, and if you want to bring all of this within design education at many ways, and one of the question was, okay, how do you basically sensitize them or make people sensitive? Yeah, the only way, as I strongly believe, is what Gandhiji says that उपदेश मत दो उदाहरण बनो, so do not advise, practice it, right? And I think people will look at it and people will take it forward, right? So I'm very sure if you are basically teaching somewhere, uh, students will look at you and possibly get inspired by the way you do things, and what you basically essentially believe in. It is your belief system which is going to translate into a younger generation. uh, Being in education, I feel younger generation is our hope, right? Sorry, I'm not sure whether I answered your question.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I like this. People generally, basically, in all of this, do not ask questions. And I wonder why. I myself have hajar questions for myself. Okay. Charumitra, if we do not have questions, then we can close the session.
Sir, I have one more question.
Yes, Shikha, tell me.
Sir, when we ask the people that your house is so beautiful and you have beautiful techniques you have used and all, they say no, no, हमारा घर तो पुराना हो गया है, अब इसको हमको तोड़ना है, हमको नया बनाना है, और उस चीज को वो समझ नहीं पाते कि उनके पास इतनी खूबसूरत चीज और इतनी कीमती चीज है, जिसको कहीं उनके अंदर वो उसका प्राउड फील कराना बहुत जरूरी है.
Shikha, I do understand, I do agree to this, but it is like it's somebody's having possibly a vintage car, at some point, and which is also not something which is so vintage at some point, and you basically park a Mercedes next to it, then that person would have an aspiration to basically go for the Mercedes and leave his or her car, at some point. So I'm just giving it more extreme. So somebody's in Ambassador, somebody's in Mercedes, so at some point people do have aspirations at some point, because you're possibly in that environment within that kind of houses for very long. You need a change, and change is inevitable at this point. What becomes very important here is that whether those changes are sensitively done or not, whether those changes are going to basically manage or maintain the equilibrium of the ecosystem or not, right? If they're able to do that, then those changes are welcome. If they are going to disrupt everything, right, completely, and they're just going to disrupt the core values of the system, then one needs to be wary about those changes. So if somebody wants to move into a pakka house or a better house, I think so it's fine. This is where possibly the architects basically will come into picture and say, okay, we'll build you one, right? What Laurie Baker used to do. So Laurie Baker used to basically build from the local materials. In a similar manner, you say, we'll build you one. And hence, you use the same set of techniques, methods, construction, but still give them something new, or at least a house which is aspirational with all the new amenities, So I think so the only way is by doing things, by talking, nothing is going to work.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Charumitra,
Yes, sir. Anyone else who want to ask any question?
Yes, sir. I have a last question. Sir, as we say that, everything trickles down, it comes from top to bottom. So if we are giving so many examples of vernacular and how to incorporate those practices, but why the people who are affluent, and who can just can afford and do things, they can't, adopt those practices.
I think so. We don't believe in the top-down trickling effect. Of course, the trickling effect does basically play a very important role, and this is where one needs to be extremely strategic. Like when we were working in Jubal, the main sarpanch basically had built a house of concrete and brick, and people looked at it and said, "Oh, wow,
True.
ठीक है, क्या बात है, and they aspire for basically something like that. Now, this is where the trickling effect basically would work. That you need to convince people, you need to find ambassadors to whom people basically believe, right? So when we were working in a place called Gundiali, which is a potter's village in Gujarat, Alibai was one of the person whom everybody used to respect and believe. And what Alibai would do, people would really basically follow. And we started working with Alibai to really revive the terracotta crafts of that region. And currently, within this last 6 years, nearly more than 28 young people, generation basically, who were not planning to join the terracotta crafts, have now been practicing that. So what we realize is that it's a strategy, to be honest, but you need a time, you need energy to invest, and India is too vast, and there's a lot more to do.
True, true.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. You really acquainted us with a very amazing construction technology that responds to natural calamities, cultural ethos, and traditions and culture, and how they are standing from years to years, decades, with having all the natural hazard and all these things. And I really very much impressed and inspired with this presentation. I think everyone is very much motivated and inspired with the presentation. The adaptability of this is a issue, and I think if every person wants to progress, and the people who are living in these houses are actually want to progress in their life also, and they want to shift to new houses. I think they get bored with their houses or whatever we call. So I think it's our responsibility, the different institutions who are working in this area, to take these preserve these technologies, and adapt it, and convert it in some new forms. That you one picture you have already shown us, how we can adapt these construction technologies and take it further. So I think we cannot say to the indigenous people also that it is their responsibility to preserve and continue it, but it is our responsibility also. So thank you very much, sir, for your very inspiring and knowledgeable and informative lecture. And I really thankful to you that you spare time for us. Still you are in quarantine, and you have supported a lot during all planning and this arrangement of the program. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So with this, we are going to end this session. The next session will start at 12:15. Till then, thank you all. We will join at 12:15. Thanks a lot.